Paul Mauro served as commanding officer of the New York City Police Department and Legal Bureau and executive officer of the Intelligence Operations and Analysis Bureau. During his career, he worked on high-profile investigations that involved close cooperation with state, federal, and foreign prosecutors, as well as the private sector. In the aftermath of 9/11 attacks on the Twin Towers, he was deployed at Ground Zero. After his retirement from the police force, he joined the DeMarco law firm, focusing on investigations, anti-piracy, electronic surveillance, mass data collection, and the use of new technologies. Mr. Mauro is a Fox News contributor, where he provides viewers with legal and criminal justice analysis. Mauro believes in the broken windows theory of policing. When things are nice, he says, people behave. When there is chaos, they feel it. And he said that is what was under former Mayor de Blasio. That was the atmosphere in the city, and it began to change. It feels like a lawless place. On the other hand, he lauds the city police for their handling of crime. The NYPD handles New Year's threats better than anyone. Aviation out and boats in the harbor, dogs, drones, directors, and detectors you don't see. Paul Mauro's subject today is the burgeoning crime wave across the country and what we should do about it. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Paul Mauro.
Well, thank you, everybody, and let me just start by saying how flattered I am to be invited here, and what a unique experience this has been. I was saying last night that even the ride in from the airport felt like a vacation after Hell's Kitchen. The greenery and how beautiful, this is a place that not only did I not know existed, but I didn't know a place like this could exist. It really is very, very unique, and I'm really happy to be here. So, quickly to it, I'm not going to reiterate my introduction. I assume some of you at least know, who I am and where I'm coming from. So what I'm going to do is just talk a little bit about where we have been regarding public safety in the country and primarily in our cities, where we are now, where I think we're going, and a little bit about maybe what we can do about it, which is, I think, something we don't think about enough. So let me get right to it. When I joined the police department in the mid-1990s, policing was in a little bit of a transition here in America. We were coming out of what I would call the malaise of the 1960s, the flower power baby boomer era, which brought us a lot of benefits, certainly, but during which the idea had become concretized that the idea of public safety and enforcement was somehow inimical to what we really wanted in a society. Police were the bad guys, to cut right to it, as were a lot of the government agencies. That had begun to sunset when I came on, fortuitously, because we saw where it had led, all right? And I can speak, I'm going to use New York City primarily as a proxy for the cities in this country, but I think it stands to reason for all of our cities, that we had hit a point where public safety had really been on the back burner for so long, we began to realize, hey, we better start to pay attention to this. That's where we were in the mid-1990s when I come along. So, quick story, I'm driving the sergeant one day, I'm in Hell's Kitchen again, where I ultimately end up living for most of my life, and we're driving up 8th Avenue in the 50s. A call comes over the radio on 57th Street of an EDP, emotionally disturbed person. That's just a term of art in the NYPD. And he is a disorderly. As we're driving up, doesn't sound like anything that we need to respond to. I'm driving the sergeant. He's only supposed to respond to things that cut to that level. Call comes over again at about 55th Street. So this guy is moving south. Not uncommon, not the end of the world. We're driving up 8th Avenue. We see a fracas going on at about 52nd and 8th. And there is a group of people gathered around. And as we get clear of the little bit of the traffic, we see a sector team, that is, 2 cops. NYPD generally rolls with 2 cops in a car, rolling around with a guy who has his shirt ripped open, he has no shoes on, his hair is all wild, he's screaming very clearly, a disturbed street person. So we realize, uh-oh, real trouble here, right? So I practically have to drive on the sidewalk to get us there. Anybody who knows Manhattan traffic knows what that's like. We get there, we jump out. I end up grabbing this guy by the legs, okay? Immediately, what happens in situations like this in New York City, of course, is a crowd gathers. And in this case, that happened, and you start to hear the things like, hey, what are you doing to that guy? Why are you beating him up? Why are you harassing this guy? Okay? Now, what had happened was he had tried to grab a baby away from a mother who was walking, excuse me, with her baby in a stroller, and he tried to take the baby away. And that's, in fact, what he had been doing as he came down 8th Avenue. And she's still there on the scene, and she's screaming in Spanish. She's Hispanic, so is he. And he's yelling, tengo sida, I have AIDS. And at this point, AIDS was still a pretty big issue. You don't hear about it as much now. And he is spitting. So if he does have AIDS, he's doing his best to spread it among the populace. So I have him by the legs, and this is the image that's burned into me and why I tell the story. I look up, and this is a fracas, and this all happens very quickly, right? I'm talking 5-10 seconds. And I look up, and I see, and one thing people don't realize is that trying to cuff somebody who doesn't want to be cuffed, I don't care how small they are, how big you think you are, is very, very difficult. They have all of the leverage. And that's why sometimes these things look a lot uglier than maybe you'd like them to be, because it's very, very hard to get even one cuff. If you get one cuff, generally you can get two because you can use it as leverage. We couldn't even cuff this guy. And I look up, and he had what we call perp strength because he was on something, right? And it was very hard to control him. We look up, and I see this very well-manicured hand, a woman's hand in what's clearly a business suit, reaching in to this melee. I know she's not part of the situation. She's holding something, and she's trying to put it in his pocket of this shirt that's hanging off of him. So I know that hand is not supposed to be there, so I don't know what's going on. I swat her hand away. Ultimately, we get control of this guy. You get him on the ground. He gets cuffed. Everybody's yelling at us, etc. ESU come, that's SWAT. They come, they mummify him, essentially. They put him in a bag, and they put the thing over his mouth so he can't keep spitting. And he gets taken away in an ambulance. The baby's fine. Everybody's fine. I pick it up. And what I see is that she was trying to put into his pocket a business card for her law firm so that he could subsequently sue the NYPD and all of us. And while we were doing this, she was working the crowd for witnesses. Now, I tell that story just because it is indicative of, I don't really believe in epiphanies, so to speak, but this was about as close as an epiphany as I ever had, at least on the police department, because I realized at that point, I came from cops, all right? My father was a cop, my uncles, a lot of them were cops, my grandfather was a cop back in Italy, and I just grew up with the assumption that people had your back. They recognized that we were the good guys. We were trying to keep people safe. And it was at that moment that, and I wasn't naive, I grew up in the city, but that's when I realized that we had lost a lot of the professional class, in this country, and that we were not perceived as the good guys in a lot of these places. And the reaction of that crowd told me that, and her actions told me that, and it was actually a good lesson to learn very early in your career. And the people I was working with were actually sort of surprised that I was as taken aback as I was, because, of course, I felt a level of outrage. Let me expand the playing field a little bit. As Paul mentioned a little bit, as I went on in my career, I subsequently ended up in a federal task force post 9/11. I ended up doing counterterrorism for a lot of years. I ran the intelligence operations in that remit for New York City. And as a result, a lot of things came through my transom that gave me a window into some of the larger issues that we face as a nation regarding public safety. So that's the story I just told is a very close to the ground story, right? A larger set of issues that I think we confront today and that stay with us now. Let's look at the various nations that are nipping at our heels. We have, let's say, the Iranians, who are constantly stealing our hardware and our software, okay? They have an intelligence model where they essentially weaponize their populace. Anything you can steal by hacking from the Americans, we'll pay you for it. Bring it to us, and we'll pay you. So, for instance, about 25 to 50 times a day, the New York City website gets scanned, as they call it, by hostile actors, many of which are going to come from Iran, all right? They do this stuff all day, every day. They use cutouts. They get a hold of software. They buy it from military contractors. They use cutouts, and they get around the sanctions. Let's go to the Russians, who all day, every day are scheming not only to disrupt our elections, but are engaging in many instances, state-sponsored ransomware. And if you have a business that depends in any way on digital, on data and data collection and communications or anything like that, down to even hotels. A famous instance is they hacked into and ransomwared a well-known hotel in Switzerland, a ski resort, a very wealthy area, and locked everybody out of their rooms so that when they came back at the end of the day skiing, nobody could get into their rooms. And they demanded a couple $100,000, a relatively low amount for ransomware, so that the hotel would pay it. Hotel did, and then they did it again the next day. All right? We get that all day, every day. I see that in my current position in the law firm I am with, but we saw it on the job as well. This stuff happens all day, every day. Let's look at, let's say, the Yemeni bodegas in New York City. Bodegas are local grocery stores. They're almost all run by Yemenis. They're criminal franchises, period, end of story. They steal our public benefits system blind. They sell all kinds of drugs, to include the synthetics these days. I don't know if it's still the biggest, but I had with my people the biggest synthetics case in that portfolio, the Yemeni bodegas synthetics, with the synthetics supplied by the Chinese in the country. It was did it with the DEA. It was about $25 million worth of stuff, and that's just when we stopped counting. And that was a very cheap high. And where do they sell it? Well, they sell it in all the cities, but they also make sure it gets into our towns that support and service the areas around our military bases to try to turn our soldiers into zombies. The Chinese, as I said, they're creating all of these synthetics, all right, including fentanyl, which you've heard about. Now they've moved on to second and third generations of fentanyl. They're running that into the country by the Mexican cartels. The leading cause of death right now for Americans between 18 and 45 is fentanyl overdose. And it's actually not an overdose, because most instances they don't know what they're taking. They're not cognizantly taking fentanyl. They're taking something else. They think they're snorting cocaine or something. There's fentanyl in it and they die. So it's really more akin to poisoning. And then we have things like MS-13 from El Salvador and Tren de Aragua coming out of Venezuela, which is a Venezuelan prison gang. Maduro seems to have taken a page from the old Fidel Castro handbook that he did in the Mariel boat lift, emptied his prisons and in his insane asylums. And consequently, we have the creme de la creme of the Venezuela prison system here, establishing a presence in our cities, and that's why you're starting to see a lot of this migrant crime bubbling up. The first one to really hit the national radar screen was the Lake and Riley case down in Georgia. Since then, we've had dozens. There's a couple that broke today in New York City and others. It's going on across the country, and they're pretty organized. They're not quite as organized as, let's say, the traditional Italian mafia. All right, they're not quite as hierarchical, but it's pretty organized. They're here. They're not going away. We're continuing to let them in. So why do I go into all of that? Because all safety is local. All right, and if you look through the pantheon of big cases that were brought down through American criminal justice history, it's generally local cops who twig to this stuff. Whether they're sitting in task forces or not, they push it out, it goes to prosecutors, and that's how the big cases are made, and that's how we protect the homeland. The problem is that these cases are not being made the way they could be and should be. When was the last time you saw DOJ make a RICO or big conspiracy case against a migrant criminal gang? That silence tells you a lot. It hasn't happened. The closest thing we've had is the NYPD made a conspiracy case, because what they do is they do this, they imported this with them. They ride around on the scooters and they grab things off of people on the scooters and then they take off. But if you resist, they'll kill you. They are running human trafficking. They are committing all kinds of robberies. They're actually fairly sophisticated when what they're looking to do when they steal from you. Yeah, they want the credit cards and all that and the cash, but they want the phones. And the NYPD case provided a window into that. They send the phones back home. The phones get jailbroken, all right? They get hacked into, which is very hard. these days. You're not supposed to be able to do that. They've managed to do it, and they get into your bank accounts. They're stealing millions, hundreds of millions of dollars. The cases are not being made. And I saw the cases not being made when I was still working. And as I said, sitting in a federal task force. Why does it matter? Because ultimately this policy comes from the top, all right? You don't have much trouble getting agents from various agencies, the three-letter ATF, DEA, FBI, whoever you're working with that day of the week. It's not that hard to get the agents involved because they're in that work not to make a lot of money. If you go into law enforcement to make money, you need to have your head examined, right? But they're there to make cases, not money. But at the end of the day, this stuff devolves to federal prosecutors. Federal prosecutors make these big cases that really protect all of us. Who chooses federal prosecutors? The White House. Every new administration chooses the federal prosecutors. Some of you may remember the big controversy when W. Bush came in, fired everybody, put in his own prosecutors. This is why he did it, because he wants his criminal justice policy. That's the privilege of every president. And I can't tell you how many times I was told, we need to go with this. And the answer I got back is some version of, there's no appetite for it. Okay? And that includes when I was watching New York City burn in 2020's quote-unquote summer of love, chasing anarchists and looters and all kinds of characters around New York City. And I was inspected. People were shocked that I was out there, but I perceived it as my job. If my people were going to be out there, and I was the head of legal too, so people, what is this lawyer doing running around the city? But nonetheless, I was out there because I was still a cop, law degree or no law degree. And I saw this happen. We couldn't make the big cases. We had lawyers on the other side throwing Molotov cocktails at cops who got sweetheart deals because, quote unquote, the appetite wasn't there. So that's the frame that I wanted to put out front just as I go forward, because that's a little bit of both the bottom and the top, okay? That's the swath of American criminal justice enforcement these days, in my perception, because that's where we are right now. And we'll close with that when we get to the end here and close the loop, because I want to frame this as something coming from the top that we all need to be aware of, and we need to understand the stakes, because this stuff really does matter. And our position as America's, or the world's leading light of democracy, which is something I think all of us take for granted and have grown up in, that's not preordained. And I think that a lot of us feel it's slipping away. I want to talk a little bit about how we got to where we are regarding all of that, and then where we are now. Mid-1990s, as I said, things began to change. We were coming out of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, early 90s. New York City set its record for homicides. Things were bad. People began to wake up. We got Rudy Giuliani as the mayor. He understood this. He said, knock it off. Let's start enforcing. The great innovation of policing worldwide came from NYPD, something called the broken windows policing approach. Now, it was created by an academic, but the NYPD actioned it, and it became the model. I used to get sent all over the world to present, to grow. I can remember sitting in a group about this size up in the mountains in Germany. It was all the leading lights of the European law enforcement and intelligence agencies, and showing a graphic, and I remember the audible gasp when I showed the crime drop. At that point, it was 91% over 20 years. Can you imagine? 91% from, 1990, I think it was our really bad year. So, this stuff does work and did work, all right? And you began to see neighborhoods, all of a sudden, new stores growing up, new housing going up. The city was, breaking record in tourism, all right? And the city was really, really thriving. In addition, NYPD had 41,000 cops, its highest number ever. And that was at a point where nobody would pay us, all right? Because Giuliani was typical Republican. He would back the cops, but he wouldn't pay you, all right? He kept an eye on the purse strings, you know? And nonetheless, though, it just goes to the fact that nobody joins a police department to make money, all right? You see yourself as the good guy. And that was the paradigm at the time. And then we got 9/11. As Paul mentioned, I was down there. I got down there about an hour after the second tower came. I was there for when 7 World Trade came down and all the subsequent stuff. I was down there a number of months. They put us on 12-hour tours. And it was obviously a sea change in the way the country perceived America's safety. It was a bit of a wake-up call. That gave us about a 10-year hangout pass. We were, even among the class that would walk around with a business card that they would like to put in an EDP's pocket, even among that class, they were somewhat silenced because the stakes seemed to have been so high. And as a result, we saw a flourishing in our urban areas and in public safety that we hadn't seen previously. New York City underwent a real renaissance. And as I said at the top, I'm using that as a stand-in for America's urban areas, but it pretty much holds. We had, as I said, record numbers of tourists, new businesses, revenue. We were fortunate to get Mike Bloomberg afterwards, who, if nothing else, understood the numbers, understood business, understood how to keep the city in the black. And he also paid us a little bit, too. And so we kept the police department morale up, and the city was breaking safety records every year. Now, the sad part of all this is that it's all cyclical. And the powers that are up against us, and when I say that, I don't mean the criminals, but I mean academia, the media, and the hyper-progressives coming out of the universities and on campus. They were just not going to put up with that. And I had a front row seat to all of it, and I began to see it slip away. All right, you began to see stories coming out in the usual journalist organs, the New York Times, some of the other more progressive outlets that just couldn't take the fact that not only was the city safe, but the primary beneficiaries of that sort of safety are the people who the progressive left purports to support and represent, which is poor neighborhoods, people of color. Who gets shot? And this is just numbers. Young black men get shot, period, end of story. If you cut down on shootings, that's the primary beneficiary. Every cop has the story of going on a noise complaint, some very low-level job, and the old woman tells you, okay, thanks for coming, etc., and just before she shuts the door, she says, they're dealing guns in that apartment, but you didn't hear it from me, and shuts the door. Because she wants to be safe, and she wants her grandchildren to be safe when they come visit, or her kids to be safe. All right? But obviously, she doesn't want to be known as the informant because that's so countercultural. And you began to see the fraying begin. And at the end, it's all about power. So we got the beginnings of a return to radicalism. And why does this matter, especially in the urban areas? Because according to the American Census Bureau, the U.S. Census Bureau, 80% of this country lives in an urban area. If you include the suburban areas whose fortunes are tied to urban areas, you're probably up over 90%. So if you control this narrative and you control this lever, you control the country. You're going to get the votes, and you're going to really set policy. And so we went back to the Blue City Blues, for lack of a better term. The Blue City mayors could not countenance the fact that the police were this successful, no matter who the beneficiary was. And I hate to be so political because generally on the air, I try to stick just to the criminal justice facts. But these days, it's really impossible to speak on criminal justice and safety issues without it being politicized because it has been so politicized. And so you began to get the sorts of mayors that we saw in New York City, like, as was mentioned earlier, Bill de Blasio, who was really just an unreconstructed 1960s campus radical who lucked into the mayoralty of New York City and began destroying all the work that went before him day one under the guise of, quote-unquote, reimagining policing, okay? And he was just a stand-in for so many others across the country who took over our major urban areas, and we're coming off the same playbook. And you name the city, we've seen it now. San Francisco, Portland, Seattle, Houston, St. Louis, Memphis, all of these places are either unlivable or becoming unlivable, no matter who you are and what demographic box you check. And somehow or other, we're all supposed to ignore that. So everything got thrown out. Broken windows was recharacterized on the campuses by the academics as something that doesn't work, that is institutionally racist. We got bail reform, which means let them right out of jail, with no recognition of the fact that there should be some limit to how many chances we give you, okay? In New York City right now, 1/3 of all shoplifting, which, by the way, is at such an epidemic that we're seeing an unprecedented number of stores closing and giving up because of quote-unquote shrinkage. That's the term of art that they use. 1/3 of them are done by 330 people. Now, New York City has about 9 million people, depending on how you cut it. 8.5 million if you don't count including migrants, undocumented, and various other transients. You got probably about 9 million people. 330 people are responsible for a full third of this hit on the business community. We can't stop them. We can't lock them. Of course we could. But that's the bail reform. They immediately get right out, and there's no mechanism. It was put through by hyper-progressives in the legislature, which I'll get to, with no thought about how this was going to affect people on the ground. And now, of course, you have coming out in the progressive newspapers and online forums, you have this idea of drugstore deserts and grocery store deserts in areas of the city. Well, why is that? Because the stores are losing money. And so the CVS packs up because that outlet loses money. The Duane Reade closes, the bodegas close. And now suddenly these neighborhoods, which are almost uniformly poor neighborhoods, are without a drugstore, without a grocery store. These are the food deserts. Well, of course they're food deserts, because you're allowing people to steal them blind. Along with bail reform, we got discovery reform. If you did investigations, you have now just a couple of weeks to hand over all of your material to the defense. Anybody, I know we got a number of lawyers here. In the discovery process, criminal discovery now, you have to hand all your stuff over unredacted, which means now the defense has the name and address of the witnesses. And of course, we've got a number of instances where those witnesses have been intimidated. Witnesses know this stuff, so they'll stop making complaints. And as a result, the entire thing has downward pressure. Raise the age. The age of criminal responsibility in New York City used to be 16. They raised it to 17. That wasn't enough. They raised it to 18. In an age where we're told by the potential next vice president that children in the single digits, 8 years old, should have the option of irrevocably altering their bodies to transition, you don't have criminal justice responsibility for your actions at 16 and 17. You're not an adult. All right? Clean slate, where everything you've done in the past has been wiped out. Right now, what they're trying to get through in New York City is clean slate to the degree that the police can't see your previous criminal justice interactions. Now, one of the first things you do when you're investigating a case and you got a guy that you're looking at is you look at where he's been arrested previously, who he got arrested with, who did he call when he made his phone calls, because those are recorded, and that's how you contextualize his network. That's also how you find people. You'll have a situation potentially, and I think it'll likely go through, where the police can't even tell, wow, this guy is a multiple recidivist, and so we need to watch what he does or investigate him further and be very careful how we handle this case. So it's also a safety issue. And then there's, of course, prison reform. And the canard they put through on this is that prison is institutionalizing somehow. Well, right now in New York City, you have about 3,500 people locked up in Rikers Island, which is the New York City jail, all right, which is for misdemeanors, a year or less that you're serving, or you're brought down to go to court because you're serving upstate in a state penitentiary on heavy felony. Right now, about 25% of that number is in for murder or attempted murder. They want to go down through the new system by closing Rikers, which is troubled. But rather than fix Rikers, they've come up with this new plan that they're going to devolve the jails to the boroughs. But what they did was, and this was a de Blasio move, they poisoned the pill. And they made sure that there would only be about half as many beds as we have now. Now, we don't lock anybody up now. We're going to go down by half, which would mean, under the current numbers, if we go down to about 3,000 beds, 50% of the people occupying the prison beds will be murderers or attempted murderers. That means we only have 1,500 beds for gangbangers, narco-traffickers, rapists, recidivist assault people, gangsters, all right? All of that goes right out the window. And you have only 1,500 beds, and that is a hard metric So I don't know what they expect is going to happen, but again, we don't lock anybody up now, and they want to literally go down about half. And all of this is built on a couple of myths, okay? I talked a little bit about the institutional racism myth that went along with broken windows policing, and I'm going to hit another very salient example of that that's going on right now. But I want to talk about two real quick. First of all, long guns versus handguns. The Pew Institute, not a right-leaning entity by any means, has put out 3% of American gun killings a year are long guns. Now, we hear great hue and cry when we have things like school shootings, or something even like we just had with Donald Trump and this guy Crooks with the AR-15, a long gun. No sentient human being thinks that those are good. Of course they're horrible. Of course you want to do everything you can to prevent them. But only focusing on those, and we saw it in the hearings regarding the Crooks shooting of Trump, we saw it devolve into a discussion of gun control. 3%, which means by definition, over 90% at the least are handguns. And what are those handguns going to be? Well, you don't need to be a criminal justice major to know that those are going to be gangbangers, perps with illegal handguns in our cities. Because that's who kills each other, okay? Stranger murders are vanishingly small, thankfully. All right, they're on the rise, but there's still a vanishingly small percentage of murders. Most murders are either for the profit motive between gun crews or drug crews, or they're domestics. Okay? So, well over 90%, and we have the laws to interdict this stuff. They're just not enforced. And so, when we have something like a horrible tragedy, like let's say Sandy Hook, that becomes the narrative, and that's what the progressives link all of this to after something like the Crooks attempt on Trump. But that isn't what drives what's really going on in our cities and across the country. Another myth. If you see a man on the street, and there's been a few of these, and they're sort of tragically amusing. I think Jesse Waters did one. And he sent Johnny out to talk to people on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, and they posed the question, how many unarmed black men do you think the police shot and killed last year? And you get like a shrug, like, I don't know, 1,000, 2,000, 5,000? That's the number you get. Okay, real number, 16. That is as per the Washington Post's police shooting database, 16, the vast majority of which involved a perpetrator trying to run the cop down with a car, perpetrator struggling with the cop and maybe even going for his gun, or a perpetrator who simulated having a gun. All right, 16 with those qualifiers. How many police were killed in the same year? 46. All right, again, these are the myths that they become foundational and received wisdom and are never questioned as they put through these policies that undermine all the stuff that worked during my crisis. I was very fortunate. I got there in the 90s, as I said. I caught the wave, and after 9/11, as I said, I was the beneficiary of the fact that we were given the benefit of the doubt. But I also was there as I began to see all of that drop off. And so I had a little bit of a unique perspective. And now the overlay for all of that, as we all know, is the influx of the migrants. And that's changing everything. MS-13 was the sort of the main threat. 2016, Trump came in. Whatever your feelings on Donald Trump, he focused on that, took down the major presence they had here in America, which was on New York's Long Island. It wasn't even in the city. He crushed them. All right, I know two guys that were on that task force. I had a window into it. I was still working at the time. They're not a big thing in New York City. They were on Long Island, destroyed them. He did that. Now, the guys who ran the case did it, but he came and told them, whatever you need, you're going to get. That's what I'm talking about, that kind of support from the top. That's what changes things. Right now, we have the whole host of characters I talked about, including coming over the border as part of the migrants, which you don't hear that much about, 30 to 50,000 military-aged Chinese. Now, they are our principal international adversary, and I use that word cognizantly. If you don't think among 50,000 military-aged Chinese there are not some intelligence assets, they would have to be stupid not to take advantage of that, and they're not stupid, trust me. All right, we also have Trende Arago, which I talked about, which we're going to be living with for a long time. The left's answer to that is, well, most migrants are well-behaved. Perhaps, okay? You can even accept the fact that, okay, yeah, they're here illegally, they're breaking the law, but they're not violent, and you know what, they're in net gain. Okay, maybe you can entertain that idea, maybe you can't. For my purposes, irrelevant. If 1% of 20 million is a criminal that's been released from a Salvadoran prison or a Venezuelan prison, you're talking 200,000 perps, hardened criminals that we've just imported into this country. We don't have enough criminals of our own. We have to import 200,000 hardened perps from overseas, and these guys are hard. I got to tell you, anybody who's paying attention and knows the history, they're, to the extent that they're, thank God they're not better organized, all right, because they'll kill you at the drop of a hat. And what you don't hear about is how much they target women, all right, and I talked about the trafficking, et cetera, but you're starting to see more and more rape reportings, all right. They control the migrant centers, all right, and the only people, again, I see that's doing the intelligence work on this stuff is the NYPD, and that's my sourcing, and so I hear that, but people talk to me, they see me on Fox from all over the country, and they control what's going in and out of those migrants, just like in any prison. The prisoners control a prison. The corrections officers are just there to keep them all in, all right? But the prisoners control the situation. The same thing in these migrant centers, with the difference is that the migrants can go in and out. So they're bringing in guns, they're bringing in drugs, and they make sure they control all money. And there's a lot of profit motive built into this. There's a lot of wrong-headed charity money that they get their hands on. And if I had a crystal ball, I suspect that some of these foreign governments have their hand in that till as well, including Maduro. So that's where we are relative to the current situation. And if you're waiting around for DOJ and Washington to take a hand in all of this, let's just remember the 4 big myths that we've been sold recently by our overhead in Washington. Number 1, the FBI and Crossfire Hurricane, which wasted the entire Trump administration trying to sell the idea that Donald Trump was a Russian asset based on an unvetted Australian confidential informant that nobody's even sure existed. If you drill down through all the noise, that's where that case started. And it was my job to drill down through noise when I was doing counterterrorism and intelligence. And we used to say the most important question in that kind of work is, how do you know? And if you ask the how do you know question in Crossfire Hurricane, you devolve to an Australian CI who almost certainly had a profit motive, and that's where that BS case came from, and we wasted all of those man-hours. And Strzok and Page just got a multi-million-dollar settlement from DOJ because they sued, because DOJ went into their phones as part of the investigation, and they just got cashiered. They just got paid for all of that. That's where that ended up. Well, I was being told there's no appetite. That's what was going on. We also had COVID from a wet market. What sentient human being would look at the fact that there are 3 gain-of-function laboratories in the world, one of which is in Wuhan, and we're supposed to believe that COVID, which likely is the biggest killer of maybe in American history, came from bat soup in a wet market? Are you kidding me? And that subsequently it has developed that, of course, we were funding gain-of-function. Fauci knew about it, and we're all supposed to ignore that. Of course, then there is our 51 best and brightest intelligence officers. In full disclosure, I had interactions with some of them who came out and said the laptops are fake. Now, any investigator looking at that thing at first said it's almost 95% real, but let's see how it plays out. And then, of course, we discover that the FBI had the laptop for a year and knew it was real and allowed all of that discussion and all that undermining of our faith in our intelligence agencies and allowed that operation to go forward because it was an operation, knowing the laptop was real. And now that these are the people that were expected to run against all the threats that I've been enumerating. And then just to close the loop, because I want to make sure we have time for Q&A, I think the most egregious of the myths that we've been sold, which is that our current president had full mental acuity. Now let's remember something. Call the lid every day during the 2020 campaign 4 years ago. We didn't see him for that entire campaign. He's held what has to be the fewest number of press conferences of any president in my lifetime. And then we all saw the debate, and we know how that all shook out. Well, everybody knew that. And why that matters is because without that leadership, you get things like we just saw in Butler, Pennsylvania, where a rudderless Secret Service doesn't have its legs under it. The head of the Secret Service is supposed to be at the RNC for that week. Instead, she's in Aspen for a security conference with God knows how many of her associates and employees on our time and our dime. That shooting happened on a Saturday. When that happened, she was in Aspen and she was scheduled to speak Wednesday. Her direct report is Alejandro Mayorkas. Secret Service has been put under DHS. He approved that? He had to designate the RNC as a national security event. There's only a handful of those a year. Those are Super Bowls for DHS. The quarterback went to Aspen for the week and took half the offensive line? Where are the communications on that? Where are the approvals? Where's the investigation? When Lloyd Austin, our Secretary of Defense, disappeared for 10 days because he had a bit of surgery that went south. The reason he went off to do that without any concerns for anybody looking for him is because he knew nobody would be looking for him. I knew bureaucracies. He wasn't getting emails back from the White House. He wasn't being called in to brief President Biden on what's going on relative to Gaza or Ukraine or any of the other trouble spots we have around the world. All right? I had to brief the Commissioner of Intelligence, sometime the Commissioner of New York City, every day for years, 7:30 a.m. If you think you want to wake up to that, trust me, you don't. All right? And yet, they weren't doing this? Of course they weren't, because he was calling lids at 11 a.m. every day and not showing up to work. And when you don't have anybody steering the ship, the agencies run on their own for a while, but they're rogue and they do what they want. When the boss is away, the employees will play. Anybody who's worked in a bureaucracy knows that. And that's what happened there, and that's what happened in Butler, PA as well, which still is not being fully investigated. As we were talking about last night, the FBI has said we're not investigating the failures of the service. We only have the attempt on Trump's life. There's a federal statute that applies. That's all they got. All right? Looking into Crooks to see if he's an Iranian asset or some nonsense, which we know is going to dead end. All right? Pennsylvania State Police has the killing of Imperator and the 2 civilians that were wounded. So who's looking into the failures of the service? The Inspector General of DHS. Who does he report to? Alejandro Mayorkas. Get comfortable. You're not going to see that report for a good while. You won't see it certainly anytime before 5 November, I can tell you that. All right? Otherwise, we have to rely on Congress. That event would have had an operations plan, designates where everybody is supposed to be and who's supposed to cover what. From what I can see, and from what I'm told, Congress still doesn't have that ops plan. That is the Bible of the event. Every ops plan, I've written them, all right? That says, you guys going to be here, you guys going to be here. That answers all the questions we all have. Why don't we have the ops plan? Why does only the FBI have the ops plan? I know I feel like, I'm almost going into conspiracy territory here. But it's not conspiracy when it's true. And I don't conjure some big cabal of people who are controlling our lives. What I'm talking about is what is, in a way, sadder. The answer really is ineptitude and a lack of leadership. And this is where it hits the ground. So the result is what? The lack of safety, cities that are deteriorating, greater threats than we've ever had externally, police morale across the board, federally and locally, at a low. Despite better pay, police departments closing up shops. I was just in Maine for a couple of days on vacation. I was watching the Maine news, which was actually very comforting because they'll lead the news on the fact that somebody got stranded on a boat. Which was like really, we're at New York City, it's like you turn the news on. 6 people killed, I learned. And they had on there, an entire police department was closing. I didn't know a police department could close. All right, and the department said, we got 3 guys, we can't get any more. They're working to capacity. I got these guys working 2 tours a day. They're burnt out. They want to retire. This is the chief talking. And he's on TV, so I'm closing up shop. What am I going to do? Call the state police if you need 911. All right? You're seeing that across the country. It's not money, it's morale. So that's kind of where we are now, and I'm going to just finish up real quickly with the election. This election's about the 3 I's: immigration, Israel, and inflation. And they all are stand-ins for bigger issue. Immigration, we've talked about the border already. You know what's going on there. Don't kid yourselves. Kamala was the border czar. That's right on the internet. Story breaking today. I suspect you'll see it going forward. Last year, she and her husband gave thousands to a defund group in Washington, D.C., and a group that supports sanctuary cities. Our border czar was giving thousands of dollars in our nation's capital to a group that supports sanctuary city status permanently for our nation's capital. We've talked about Alejandro Mayorkas. He came out, told the national media and our entire country on camera that his own agents were shamefully whipping Haitian migrants as they tried to get across the Rio Grande, his own people. When he said that, the New York Post has demonstrated, when he said that, he knew it wasn't true. The emails demonstrate that he knew that those were the reins for the horses that they were holding. He threw his own people under the bus for that little political blip. Okay? That's who you're dealing with there. So we know now they just suspended the program under which Jose Ibarra got into the country, the alleged killer of Laken Riley down in Georgia, because it was rife with fraud. I was screaming about how fraudulent that program is on the air. All of that matters because when we go into the DNC, all right, you're going to see all of these things bubble up in the second I, which is the Israeli issue. Now, wherever you stand on Gaza is immaterial. I'm not talking about the politics of that. What I'm talking about domestically, what we're going to see. During the DNC, you're going to see the progressive groups come out and force the way they occupied our campuses. You're going to see battles with cops. All right. This time around, I suspect there's going to be a lot more enforcement because they don't want the optic of this kind of anarchy. But they're also planning to do what they did on the campuses in the fall semester. Chicago's mayor was eliminating one of their electronic programs, a thing called ShotSpotter, which detects gunshots in New York City. He said it led to, in Chicago, led to over-policing in underprivileged areas. Then they got the DNC. He decided, oh, you know what, we'll keep it a while. And he's getting rid of it in September after the DNC. So that's a tell, all right? All of that relative to Israel is going to hit the road as we go into the election. These are part of the potential October surprises. And then the third I, inflation, and all I can say is if you come to me for financial advice, you should have your head examined. So I'm going to punt on that. All right? All right, let me just close with a couple of real things so we have time for questions. First of all, you have to say to yourself, why? Why is this where we are now? What's led to all of this? Where did it go sideways, and what did these people believe in? Look, I'm no psychoanalyst, but from where I can see, having had a front row seat, these are luxury beliefs. When you don't have to worry where lunch is coming from, where you don't have to worry about putting gas in your car, this is the kind of stuff that you can feel free to indulge in. And really, it's a symptom of success. And there's a reason that all of this is coming from our elites, and why our blue-collar folks who do have to worry about putting gas in their car. If anybody's read Hillbilly Elegy, which I recommend, by the way, it's a very strong book, you get a real glimpse into that, and that's kind of how I didn't grow up in the hills of Kentucky or something, but I understand that mindset. When you have to worry about survival more than virtue signaling, you don't indulge in this sort of stuff. And at the end of the day, it becomes a competition. And because these generations that are coming up now don't know how hard we had to fight to get America to where it is now, who don't seem to know the history of the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, World War I, World War II, the Cold War, the war against terror, the scourge of communism, which was the most inimical, imbecilic system ever devised, and yet seductive to almost half the world. They don't realize what we had to do to get here, and so they can indulge in this stuff. And ultimately, it becomes about power. Criminal justice, public safety, policing, whatever you want to term it, is among the last bastions of traditional institutional conservatism, certainly among our government institutions. it is still baked into the cake among the police departments that we're the good guys and that public safety is something to strive for. And we're not institutionally racist. The NYPD, for the vast majority of my career, was majority minority. Only among progressives could majority minority be a term that makes any sense. The current hierarchy of the NYPD is all either black, Hispanic, or female. And yet, still, the police department is charged with institutional racism while we have a black mayor. And that's how we got to where we are, and that's the current situation. And that's why it feels like it is slipping away. Now, is there any good news? Well, what you can do about it. A friend of mine, rest in peace, Andrew Breitbart, once said something very wise. Politics is downstream from culture. And that's true. So, first, you have to watch the culture. TV, Hollywood, we all know, hate the traditional values, hate, for the most part, you can't make a movie without some cop being in there as on the take or a 1950s Southern-style, dyed-in-the-wool racist, all right? And it's just a cliche that they just won't give up, all right? Because it's part of the power structure, and it's very convenient for them, all right? So, you have to watch what you patronize. And there are people who are aware of this. What's his name? Ben Shapiro has started a series of entertainment things to sort of supplant this stuff. And they're not embedded with right-wing messaging. They are designed to be message-free, but at least they're not trying to drill into the minds of children, because he started a series of children's shows that at 8 years old you should be considering transitioning. Local legislatures matter a great deal. As I said at the top, all safety is local. And the local legislatures are what kill us in New York City and in New York State, all right? All the bail reforms and all those reforms I talk about come out of Albany, and they happen when nobody's paying attention. But that's really what constrains and controls the situation. Groups. Forming groups like this are vitally important. It keeps your morale up. It is a force multiplier. It lets you know that you're not the crazy ones. You're not the ones who have lost the thread. They're the ones who have lost the thread. But it's also a way to have your voices heard and out there. Social media. Whether you like it, hate it, or indifferent, it matters. These days, that's America's public forum. That's America's Times Square. The good news is you got Musk, who won't engage in the kind of censorship on X, Twitter, that have become the routine there. I don't really like engaging that much on social media because it tends to devolve into name calling, so I take the high road and then drip and sort of dip out. But it matters for the same reason that other people see it and say, I'm not nuts, they're nuts. And that this guy's making a lot more sense. And then finally, we have to enlarge the tent. We're doing that, and that's important. And groups like this do it. We have one great secret weapon: common sense. Right? Thank you. Our ideas are more compelling. Our eyes are open. We understand what works and what does not. Okay? And our stuff does not occur in ivory towers and some pie-in-the-sky academic forum. This is the stuff that has built this country and created this society. It is compelling. Right now, Donald Trump is polling at about 50% among Hispanics. He doesn't even speak Spanish, all right? And he's got that number. He's peeling off black votes. It matters. A great hidden constituency, Muslims. When I did counterterrorism work, my guys, a lot of my detectives, best detectives, were Muslim guys, Muslim people. You know, a lot of them were women as well. You know, just like when you went after the mafia, you used Italians, right? Well, in this case, we're doing counterterrorism. These were the people who understood the culture. Most of them were first generation. They are the closest thing we have to the old Ellis Islanders. It's not work, church, and home. It's work, mosque, and home. They get it. They're family people. They tend to be almost uniformly conservative. They want safety. They want the kind of things that built this country. That's why they're here. And let me just, and that, by the way, pertains to a lot of Hispanics as well who have been here and coming here legally. So let me close with this last little bit of a story real quick. So going on Fox News, you know, they send a car for me. I get to know some of the drivers. I take Ubers all the time. And again, the closest thing I've had to an epiphany, guy's driving me to work. He's from an African country. And we're having this kind of discussion. And it's funny, the drivers are all conservative because they're out there. They see the city. All right? And, you know, he's probing me for where I stand on all of this stuff. And I'm going to Fox, so he probably assumes I'm right-leaning. The damn brakes, right? Now he realizes I got a friendly in the back seat. Bang, bang, bang. What's going on in this country? What's going on in this city? Everywhere I look, there's this, there's that, there's this, and everything else. And then he said to me, and this is what has stayed with me, this is what I left. What I see here now is what I left to come here to get away from. And the thing that struck me so much there is that what we need to remember is that America's position as the city on a hill, the shining light of democracy and safety, the nation of last resort, is not preordained. That's not an inevitability. If history has taught us anything, from the Romans to the Greeks to the Renaissance, whoever you want to invoke, is we can lose it. And we can lose it fast. And again, I've seen it in New York City. It's a lot harder to build than it is to tear down. Something you build can fall apart in a week. And you're not wrong if you feel like it is starting to slip away. And so, what do? You engage the way we've talked about. Because if we don't fight, as somebody we all know said, we can lose it. And we could lose it in our lifetimes. That's what I got. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen,
Thank you.
we have virtually no time for questions because Mr. Mauro has to leave almost immediately to go to Buffalo to catch a flight. So I have Mike D up here, but make it short.
So, thank you very much. That was excellent. Beyond ineptitude, are there people in the U.S. government who purposely turn a blind eye to the cyber assaults or the other crimes committed by foreign nationals who are in this country? In other words, do we have a corruption problem embedded in the United States government? Period.
Tough question, and I'm not sure I have enough insight now to definitively answer that. What I would say is, in my experience, a genuine threat would be addressed, but there's no accounting for a laziness and incompetence. Short of a genuine sleeper asset that's put here by a foreign nation, we're far more likely to fall victim to members of the security services who just can't be bothered. And, you know, it's a continuum. If you're doing that kind of thing, it shades into a little bit of what you're talking about. And I talked about the summer of love after George Floyd in the summer. And a lot of that stuff where they were burning cities down, and that we saw in the universities at the end of the last semester, and that we're going to see at the DNC that I've talked about, it's coming out that a lot of that stuff has foreign money embedded in it. Now, if you are purposely ignoring that activity, sitting in DOJ, because the White House doesn't want the optic because they're worried about the vote in Michigan, which is going to be swung almost certainly by Hamtramck and some of the areas with a heavy Islamic population. If you're ignoring that for policy purposes, is it corrupt? You'd have to make that call. But that's where I'd say that continuum devolves to.
Okay. I'm a Chautauquan and a resident of Jamestown, and our county has the highest rate of poverty in New York State. We have had a large increase in our homeless population due to having one of the very few psych and drug rehab facilities whereby the people are discharged into our community and do not get back to their home communities. So my question is, how do you think your mayor or Governor Hochul, for that matter, are going to handle the huge number of illegal immigrants into New York City? and the small towns like us, in
Yeah.
these surrounding towns, what should we be ready for, prepare for? Because right now we're out of control sort of with homeless coming, and we have that issue. So how do you see it for our small towns going forward in New York?
Yeah, you're in trouble. Yeah. Listen, I'm not a fan of Hochul. I don't think, I hate to be quite so blunt, but I'm not sure she's ever had an original idea in her life. And she's an accidental governor, all right? Every spot that she's gotten, she's kind of fallen into. She's on record recently saying at a press conference to the president, send us more Venezuelans. You can look it up. I've been to Venezuela, by the way, years ago. People were beautiful. Country's beautiful. It just shows you what a lack of leadership can do. That country should be a powerhouse. They have oil. They have tourism. They have a number of different climates. It's a beautiful place. And instead, it's a basket case. So she's out there saying, bring us more. I need to fill jobs. I want to fill campus jobs, cafeterias. That's the week now, that Jose Ibarra allegedly murdered Lake and Riley. He was working in the University of Georgia cafeteria. All right. This is what we want to do. We want to take unvetted Venezuelan migrants. Unvetted is the key now. And there's no ability to vet them because Venezuela won't cooperate. And put them on campus with our young people. We want this. The only thing more wrong-headed than that came from Mayor Adams, who gave a similar press conference and said he wanted to make them lifeguards in New York City so that they could then deal with even younger kids.
Because they were good swimmers, he said.
Yeah, great. Great idea. Not that they'll potentially use them as drug runners or inculcate them into gang activity. Of course they could and would. But I wish I had a better answer, but the bottom line is that the virtue signalers that currently run the New York state government, both at the governor level and where the dam really broke is and as I was talking about it, the New York state legislation. The legislature, we lost the balance. It had always been about even, and the left couldn't get their more radical stuff through. And there's a reason that the criminal justice reforms in New York State, which all of you suffer from under as well, occurred in 2019, even pre-George Floyd, because that's the year that the Democrats got control of both houses of the legislature. And then without the benefit of any input from law enforcement, district attorneys, anybody on that side of the tablet, they put in all of those criminal justice reforms using only the defense bar, the defense lawyers, and the criminal justice advocates on the other side of things to rewrite those laws. That has been essentially the wish list of the left progressive criminal justice agenda for my entire career, but you never thought it would really happen. And then behind closed doors, one day you woke up and they had the ability to do it, and they put it in at light speed. And we're still paying for it. And by the way, one thing I want to mention, you're going to hear a lot going into the election about how crime has gotten better. All right, I see them banging that gun. Buttigieg said it the other day. There's an Axios report that Fox sent me that came out today. Don't believe it. We're up in New York City 35% in violent crimes, rapes, robberies, murders, and felony assaults since 2019 under the programs that you're talking about, all right? And yet, the FBI carries those numbers as having gone down. The FBI and NYPD numbers in terms of homicides have always been uniform. Murder's murder. It's the same definition. Have always been uniform. Last year, they started to diverge. Right now, the FBI is carrying something like 35 fewer bodies for New York City than the NYPD. So what happened? They forgot to count? So you see what you're up against. But yeah, look, what you need to get here is you got to get something. This is what I mean. Nobody pays attention to a local state senator election. Who cares, right? And somebody will come to you and say, come on, help, give me $20. I'm trying to fund my campaign, and it feels like money down the well. But they don't do that. It's so part of their self-image, as I was saying. It's so part of the power structure, and they don't have to worry about gas in the car. And so they're so evangelical about it that when you're not looking, all of a sudden you realize The progressives, and I'm not even talking about Democrats, I'm talking about progressives, because those are the ones who are most evangelical about it. One day you wake up and you realize they're controlling my life.
Last question.
Hi. Oh, okay. I'm Mary D. I live in Silver Creek, which is just, on Lake Erie. However, I'm sorry. And Buffalo school system has to pay teachers about for 53 different languages. And we got this coming into our system. And when I was growing up, we couldn't wait to turn 16, get that pickup truck and get the gun rack in the back, and we didn't have any school shootings.
Right.
Okay. Do you think it's good or that teachers should be able to carry in the school?
Oof, tough question. I'm gonna, oh God, that's very tough. You've stood me up here a little bit. Look, at the end of the day, they do have that right. And if you adjudicated that, just because you're a teacher doesn't mean your Second Amendment rights went away. So, I always lawyer these things when I get a really tough question. So, do I you know what? I got to say yes, because they have that right. Second Amendment is, and it's second for a reason. First is there's a reason the First Amendment is the first. That's the real thing that's most unique about America, by the way. Our First Amendment makes America America. Any hit on that, and we should all immediately activate. And by the way, Kamala Harris has some interesting ideas about the First Amendment. But as far as the Second Amendment goes, if you're a teacher, yeah, you still have Second Amendment rights, and if you feel like that's necessary, fine. Just to expand on it a little bit, one of the things I always talk about that I think would be a worthwhile program to double tap that would be, as I talked about, cops join police departments for the mission, not the money. When they retire, that's what they miss. All right. You always the cliche is, oh, I don't miss the job, but I miss the people. Yeah, it is that. I miss the circus. I don't miss the clowns. But the thing you really missed is the mission. It's the only job where somebody's introducing you. They say, "This is Paul. He's a cop." Right? You don't say, hey, "This is Paul. He's a dentist." Right? And sometimes I think it's supposed to watch what you say. Right? But a lot of retirees lose that. And I think there should be a program for public safety officers in schools that are police retirees. They tend to be good with kids because you got to deal with a lot of that stuff down through your career. You go into all kinds of situations where the parents are fighting, one of them's dead, the kids are dead. You got to deal with that. And they tend to be good with kids. They have a lot of experience. They're tough to rattle, but they are, by law, empowered to carry the guns. And I would argue that a national program where you, and don't federalize it, it should be at the state level, where you get retirees, and maybe sunset the age and everything, etc., but get retirees and get them into those circumstances. But to stop punting, I'm going to say yes to you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Paul Mauro.
Thank you.